This is Steve Zeltzer with KPFA WorkWeek Radio, and I'm talking with Darrell Whitman, who is a former federal OSHA employee, was with the Whistleblower Protection Program in San Francisco, member of OSHA, a worker at OSHA, and he and many other whistleblowers around the country, federal whistleblowers, have been fighting for many, many years to get justice against the retaliation and punishment of them for exposing corruption and the malfeasance within the federal government. Welcome to WorkWeek Radio, Darrell.
Happy to be here.
So, Darrell, why don't you talk about what is going on in the federal government? Because now there's a national campaign around whistleblowers and the exposure of a whistleblower who has been exposing the role of President Trump, allegedly, in his corruption. So maybe you can talk about what has been going on, what is happening with the inspector generals, and are they defending whistleblowers?
Well, good question, and it's a timely question. I've been watching fairly carefully the reports coming out, and it was predictable. We talked about it within our group of whistleblowers about 6 months ago, that one of the strategies of the resistance, as they call themselves, was to create nonprofit organizations that would come to bring complaints against the Trump administration, to harass them in different ways, and also to keep that narrative alive for the deep state Democrats that are running several of these committees. So we had anticipated this, and the way it's working is, as you see with earlier when you had this complaint that was brought to the Office of Special Counsel with regard to President Trump, the Office of Special Counsel, immediately expedited this supposed violation of the Hatch Act and made it a priority. But if you look at the actual reports, the facts which are found in the 2018 audit of the OSC by the Government Accountability Office.
This is the Office of Special Counsel?
Yes, I'm talking now about the Office of Special Counsel. But it's one of two. Let me back up just a moment. It's one of two organizations in the federal government that are there, at least theoretically, to provide accountability and ensure that the federal government operates according to the law. But in fact, both the Office of Special Counsel and the Inspectors General, which is the internal mechanism that's supposed to ensure that each of the departments in the federal government have this watchdog that's supposed to receive complaints, whistleblower complaints, yes, but generally to sit there and look at these departments and make sure that they're following the law. That certainly is not happening, and that has been a major source of corruption inside the federal government. I think that there's 82 inspectors general, and about 10 years ago they organized themselves into something called the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. It's called SIGI, and this group operates independently of almost everyone. It's almost without any oversight itself. So one of the principals, the person who chairs this group, is Michael Horowitz. Now, I think people now know who Michael Horowitz is. He is the Inspector General for the Department of Justice. And curiously, and I know a year or so ago, there was some comment about this, all this corruption that has emerged from the Department of Justice and from the FBI, which is part of the Department of Justice, and it's been going on for quite a few years. All of this emerged under the watchdog of Michael Horowitz. And somehow Michael Horowitz never saw anything going on. Somehow no one ever brought any reports to him, which is not credible, because I know for certain at least one brought a report to him. And he never investigated these things until he got pressure with regard to to this Spygate, whatever they call it. I don't know. I've lost track of that now.
So is Michael Horowitz aware of all the many whistleblowers that you've been working with, yourself and other whistleblowers at federal agencies?
Absolutely. He's intimately involved. In fact, just recently, we have managed to document that Michael Horowitz trying to protect Scott Dahl, the Inspector General for the Department of Labor, who is the man that blocked an investigation that I requested back in 2014 because it involved Secretary Thomas Perez, who I think you will recognize. Thomas Perez is now chair of the Democratic Party, and corruption that he had overseen and been involved in the Department of Labor. So that was a little shocking, that the Inspector General, rather than actually take a complaint and investigate it, kicked the can down the road, told me to go off to the Office of Special Counsel. And on the very issues I raised, there was an audit, the Whistleblower Protection Program, that followed in 2015. And in that audit, they actually quote high-level people in the program saying, "Oh, well, the laws just don't apply to us," which was an astounding thing to read in an audit, and that this audit and this report from the inside of the Whistleblower Protection Program never got highlighted. I don't know what happened to that audit, if anybody actually read it, but it was clear, convincing evidence that the very thing I was reporting and asking for an investigation was itself reported by the people, the auditors, with the Inspector General, Scott Dahl. So, I go off to the Office of Special Counsel and, spend now, 4 years or more waiting. And then we get this report in 2018 that the Office of Special Counsel has bottled up over, I think of the complaints it's received from federal employees about wrongdoing, and this covers the entire government. They received something between fiscal year 2011 and fiscal year 2016, 5 years. They received over 8,000 complaints from inside the federal government, which is a lot, but of course there are many, many more that never reached the level of being recorded as complaints. But in any case, of those 8,000 reports, only 0.8% received a timely investigation. So 99.2% of federal whistleblowers were denied due process, and the people of the United States were denied an investigation to correct corruption in the federal government by the Office of Special Counsel. And they were often working, as the audit in 2018 showed, they were often working directly in collaboration with the inspectors general to bottle up these complaints and to deny investigations and to protect.
Well, do you think there should be an investigation of Michael Horowitz about why he has been covering up, apparently, the retaliation against many federal employees who have in compliance?
And again, I noticed in the press here about a year and a half ago that question was raised, not with regard to his role as chair of SIGI, but with respect to his role as the Inspector General for the Department of Justice. That these things have been going on, and you ask, well, we have a watchdog there called the Inspector General. Where has he been? What has he been doing? And obviously, he has been doing nothing for years in the face of what everybody now sees as a thoroughly corrupted senior leadership particularly in the FBI, but also these people in the senior leadership in the Department of Justice. So, of course, and I think what the mainstream media is not telling you, and I think it's because they simply don't know themselves. I have not seen the New York Times, the Washington Post, any of the major media people, NBC or CBS, ABC, I haven't seen any of these people actually ask the question of how does the government work? And as a consequence, they're sitting there with this most recent case, the one that came out of the Defense Intelligence. I can't remember which one of these intelligence agencies, but this report that supposedly someone came and made a disclosure about surveilling the president and his conversations on the phone. And this person was disturbed, and somehow this rises to the level of a complaint that should be investigated by the Inspector General, that particular Inspector General. And, they're making a big deal out of it, but the reality is the only things that count as whistleblower complaints are reports of violations of law, rule, and regulation, the waste of government funds, or a specific and substantial risk to the public safety, health, and financial security. That's all that qualifies. Listening to the president on a telephone conversation has nothing to do with whistleblowing.
One of the whistleblowers, you have been working with, Johnny Burris, has been exposing the corruption with J.P. Morgan, and he was retaliated against for exposing the fact that J.P. Morgan was forcing him to steer their clients to get bad investments. This issue of J.P. Morgan violation, that apparently, again, did not rise to Michael Horowitz's concern or the concern of the Inspector Generals.
Well, it was brought to their attention. Let's be fair here. Johnny's case was reported specifically and on multiple occasions to Scott Dahl, who is the chair of the CIGI Integrity Committee. He's supposed to be the ultimate Inspector General. And he has not only has he known about Johnny's case and 13 other whistleblower cases in detail, he's done everything he can to ensure that there's no investigation of them. So this is hardly what we would think of as being, a watchdog organization to protect the integrity of the government and to ensure the protection of whistleblowers. Quite the opposite. And Scott Dahl was appointed as chair of the Integrity Committee by Michael Horowitz.
So apparently these people are conspiring among themselves to basically prevent and obstruct justice by not actually investigating complaints of many, many whistleblowers in the federal government. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, and I'm not just saying that based on an inference. It's on fact. You just look at the record which was made by the Government Accountability Office in 2018, and they said in 99.2% of the cases there were no investigations. Well, there's no credibility. You can't say that over 8,000 federal employees went to the trouble and took the risk, because it's a big risk to make a complaint, and brought that risk, accepted that risk and brought those complaints forward, and that only 0.8% of them received any kind of due process in an investigation. So that means that 99.2% of them were basically covered up, hidden. And that's a lot of cases. And that's only from fiscal year 2011 through 2016. If we continue that average, we're probably looking at 12,000 or more federal whistleblowers who've never received due process, never been protected, never had their reports investigated. The public has never been protected by that investigation. And the people who are corrupt in the government have not been brought to accountability. And that's only the federal government. If you look at the Whistleblower Protection Program in OSHA, which is only about private sector whistleblowers, we're probably talking 20 to 30,000 more cases. So I'm pleased that there's some interest suddenly in whistleblowers, but where is that interest being directed? It's not being directed at the literally tens of thousands of whistleblowers who have been trashed by the supposed organizations that are supposed to be protecting them, but now this system is being used as a weapon against a political opponent and manipulated not in the interest of the American public, but in the narrow political interests of a small group of people who apparently think it's more important to protect corruption than it is to expose it and clean it up.
And we're speaking with Darrell Whitman. He is a fired federal OSHA whistleblower with the Whistleblower Protection Program and has been fighting with other whistleblowers in the federal government and in private industry for accountability. And recently in the San Francisco Chronicle, there was an article by some journalists, investigative reporters, that the Hunters Point shipyard and Treasure Island were kept off the list of Superfund sites for some mysterious reason. And Michael Madry, who was one of the whistleblowers, who was a quality assurance manager at Test America, found that tests had been falsified on the Hunters Point development. Now, in San Francisco, Nancy Pelosi, the head of the Democratic Party, who's a congresswoman here, Kamala Harris, who's senator, Gavin Newsom, who was mayor of San Francisco, now governor of California, Dianne Feinstein, whose husband has been associated with developers in this project in Hunters Point and Treasure Island. It seems, do you think that they might have had something to do with the fact that the Hunters Point and Treasure Island were kept off the Superfund site of the EPA?
Oh, I think that there's a very solid argument that I could make and document that this whole system of corrupting the inspectors general, corrupting the Office of Special Counsel, this is a giant protection racket, and it's designed to allow political appointees, and this is with both parties, not just the Democrats, but the Republicans are involved in this as well, to protect senior bureaucrats and senior political appointees from accountability for basically violations of law. So it's also a system that is surrounded by corporate influence. I think that's also not well understood. I don't see much discussion about it, certainly, and I look for it. But you have something called the Senior Executive Service, and this is an elite of elites in the federal government. They are senior bureaucrats that hold both political appointments and civil service appointments, and some of them are making as much as $400,000 a year to come in and, quote, be the managers. They are the actual managers of what goes on inside the federal government. And guess who advises them? Guess who provides their training? Those are corporate entities that are there to teach them how to be good corporate representatives. So you actually have the major corporations through these very sophisticated operations going in and providing the guidance, the training, and the incentives for this group of high-level federal bureaucrats to draw close to the interests of the corporate parties and collaborate with them to achieve the goals that the corporations, set. They're not representing the public interest in any sense. And, of course, a lot of them go from the federal government to corporations, but also many of these SES appointees, very elite people, actually come in lateral from corporation into the government to run it. So, I think most people think that, we vote for representatives, we vote for a president, that these are the people who are running the federal government. That would be wrong. The people who are running the federal government are these senior bureaucrats. They decide, as I've read, they decide what laws apply, what laws don't, who's held to account, and who's protected. And so the people who aren't protected, obviously, are the whistleblowers. It's why there's a war on whistleblowers. And it's a war conducted by these senior people inside the government who were there representing corporate interests.
And back to the case of Johnny Burris, a whistleblower at J.P. Morgan. The SEC, the government agencies, were supposed to protect him. Apparently, he has not been protected, and J.P. Morgan has gotten off with the slaps on the wrist for basically defrauding its customers and criminally conspiring to rip off the American public. Do you think J.P. Morgan is going to be prosecuted or held accountable by these government officials who are supposed to be in charge of accountability?
No. And again, this is both the Republican and Democratic Party. Both of them are corporate parties. I think that's widely understood. Now that we have Citizens United, and even before that, you had massive influence by corporate interests in the operations of the federal government. So, no, that's why you didn't have any accountability for Wells Fargo, and they defrauded 3.5 million people. No accountability. How does that happen? In Johnny's case, you have FINRA. Not only did did J.P. Morgan, in effect, the officers got away with it. The shareholders paid the price, and a lot of those shareholders, keep in mind, are basically retirees that have funds in a retirement account that invests in stock. So the penalty went to the shareholders who paid the fines, basically, while the corporate officers who were involved in the corruption walk away with golden parachutes. This is corruption par excellence.
And in the case of Wells Fargo, John Stump, the CEO, was allowed to leave Wells Fargo with $100 million by Eric Holder, who was Attorney General under Obama, and the whistleblowers who blew the whistle on the criminal activity, really, of Wells Fargo coercing bank workers in California to fraud, set up fake bank accounts. They are still waiting for justice, aren't they?
That's right. You had over 5,000 Wells Fargo employees who made some sort of report internally. You had at least 100 that came to OSHA, at least to the Department of Labor, tried to make whistleblower complaints. All of them were denied. There was one single complaint. After the report came out, an egregious instance where they supposedly were going to negotiate something with Wells Fargo for this one single whistleblower. I don't think that anything's happened to that even. So what's the message here? The message is, if you're a corporate officer, you have nothing to worry about. You can steal the public blind. You can defraud them. You can take their homes. You can take their jobs. You can take their savings. And nothing is going to happen to you except, you might have to leave a little early with a golden parachute.
And we're speaking to Darrell Whitman, a fired lawyer, investigator with a Whistleblower Protection Program at OSHA. And he has been working with whistleblowers, both in the federal government and private industry, to demand accountability and justice. And the senators who are now saying, and Congress people who are now saying that there should be investigation of Trump because of this whistleblower, this Horowitz, and the who's basically saying that this has this release of this whistleblower's report. Senator Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, are they aware of these other whistleblower complaints at Wells Fargo and at Hunters Point Bayview of people like Michael Madry who've been terminated because of blowing the whistle?
Yes, they are. And particularly in the case of Wells Fargo, that was a big public scandal about the corruption. You had Elizabeth Warren, yelling and jumping up and down in her seat, demanding an investigation, which she, of course, never got, about that case. And there's widespread coverage about that case. Did you hear anything from any of these political representatives saying we need to have accountability? Nothing. Silence. And Dianne Feinstein received specific reports from me in 2014 about the corruption in the Whistleblower Protection Program, and the fact that Michael Madry's case was one of those cases. And when she found out that it involved Secretary Perez, all of a sudden her office, writes to me and says, well, we're not going to do anything. Well, that's just political cronyism, that she put the interests of her political associations above the interests of the public. 3.5 million of them. Well, what does that tell you about who she's actually representing in Congress? The same with Nancy Pelosi. The same with most of those, particularly the longer-term representatives. It's developed into this little club.
Jackie Spear, who's known as the Whistleblower Protection of Whistleblowers, what was her role?
Johnny Burris actually went down and talked to her office and gave them all the details back, and this was in 2016, 2017, silence. Nothing. I wrote to her and gave her all of the information, perfected allegations, the documents that showed what had happened to Johnny, and I didn't even get a thank you for that.
I guess it was too hot to handle.
And yet you have her, she's down there claiming to be a member of the Whistleblower Protection group in the House. That's a joke.
And both the Democrats and Republicans, as you say, have been aware of these many, many whistleblower complaints and complaints about the Inspector Generals, Dahl, and from the different agencies. Why hasn't there been hearings? I mean, both the Democrats control Congress; they could have hearings. The Republicans control the Senate; they could have hearings. It seems like you and many other whistleblowers have been waiting for congressional hearings where the stories about accountability and corruption and cover-ups could go on, but it seems that Congress, both houses, are refusing to take this up.
Yes, at this point, we have given the documents. We've given the very specific documents that demonstrate clear and convincing evidence of the corruption. There's no doubt about it. This isn't just some off-the-wall, general shot across the bow thing. This is very specific, targeted complaints and documents, and they're now all part of the public record. You can FOIA them from the Office of Government Information Services. They're all on record there. They've been sent to all of the senior people in the House and in the Senate. They've had them for months, and thus far, I haven't seen any real movement towards saying, well, maybe we need to have hearings. Maybe we need to talk to Johnny Burris and Mike Madry and see what's going on here, because we have serious threats to the public. This isn't, these aren't complaining about the coffee. These are really serious complaints involving millions of Americans and people who have suffered severe injury, and some of them have died because of the neglect of the public interest by federal officials and by the political representatives that are supposed to be representing the public.
And, of course, in San Francisco, the district of Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris, who was Attorney General in California and now Senator, there's a cancer epidemic at Hunters Point Shipyard and the Treasure Island. Many of the African-American people and people in the community have gotten cancer as a result of the radioactive dump that both these sites are. It seems that there's very little interest by these politicians, Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, Kamala Harris, in getting to the bottom of why there's a cancer epidemic and why there's been a cover-up of the testing, billion-dollar eco-fraud by Test America and Tetra Tech of these dangerous, highly dangerous sites.
No, unfortunately, that's very sad truth. How can we justify, ignoring the real effects of this corruption? The people who are out there in Hunters Point and Treasure Island and all the other places where they have been, their interest, their health has been basically ignored by the political class. How can they justify that? Those are real people in real communities.
And us people of San Francisco should demand that Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, and Kamala Harris do investigations, have congressional hearings on why this isn't even an EPA site, Superfund site, Hunters Point and Treasure Island, even though the evidence is that it should be because of the high contamination there, radioactive contamination.
Well, obviously, this is a case that begs investigation because of the long-term corruption that has gone on around Hunters Point and Treasure Island. This has been going on for decades. It involves a lot of people in high places in both the political community and the business community, locally and nationally. This is a case that, like back when we had Love Canal. I think we might remember Love Canal, if you're old enough, that set off the whole issue of toxic waste sites, and it ended up getting a lot of legislation. This is probably my way of thinking. It has to be one of the biggest, most important, most critical incidents that needs to be thoroughly investigated. I would say, calling for an investigation is great, but the reality is the people that you've identified, they don't represent the public. They represent the political class that's closely connected to the corporations, and their interest is in making lots of money for themselves. And that's why they're in office. That's why they stay there. That's why they get millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to secure themselves a place in the political system. And I don't know. I think they just need to be taken out. You can't do that. You can't recall federal officials, senators and Congress people, but certainly this needs to be openly challenged, and they need to go away.
Well, it seems like the Republican Congress people and senators who have the information that you and other whistleblowers are providing have an easy target, easy opportunity to start to investigate what has been going on in San Francisco at Hunters Point and Treasure Island, yet complete silence by the Republicans who control the Senate. Do you find that strange?
I do and I don't. On the one side, I know some of these people, a little better than most other people do, because I've had direct contact with their staffs and people around them. this is a serious war going on inside the federal government for control. And I appreciate that what they're doing, as with this hearing that took place with Michael Horowitz a couple of days ago. Now, I was listening to it, and there was Mr. Meadows and Mr. Jordan, the two Republicans on the committee, the two probably senior ones. And I listened carefully, and what they were doing, and of course the media didn't recognize it, is they were probing Inspector General Horowitz, because they were there. What they're trying to do is they're trying to create a record, a basis for investigating him as basically the kingpin, one of the kingpins, linchpins of this system of this protection racket that works through the Office of Inspector, the SIGI, and through the Inspector General. And I could hear that. I could hear that because I've had this conversation with some of these House Republicans, and I know that they have the documents. I know that they have the evidence in front of them, but having the evidence, you still have to make the case. These people are lawyers. They know. They know as soon as they announce an investigation of Michael Horowitz, what's going to happen is all hell's going to break loose, because Horowitz is very close to Dianne Feinstein's group and the rest of these folks, and they're going to fight like hell to do everything to smear, to obfuscate, to obstruct any investigation of Michael Horowitz. So it's a tough battleground, and you have to choose your time and place and points of attack to get at this corruption. It's very widespread, it's deeply embedded, and it's highly activated at the moment to protect the most visible among the people who are part of this group. But last week, we have suspected Michael Horowitz for a long time because of his role inside this organization of inspectors general. Gives him the opportunity to move people around, number one, but to create these appointments like he did with Scott Dahl. And you have to ask, if Scott Dahl is as corrupt as we now know he is, we have thoroughly documented that this man's a criminal. We're not talking about somebody who's inept. We're talking about somebody who's smart and using his position to attack whistleblowers relentlessly and to prevent accountability. So he should go away immediately, shouldn't he?
Well, Scott Dahl, you have provided the information about his activity. What kind of information did you provide to Congress and the federal government about the role of Scott Dahl?
We copy all of our documents to the leadership in the House and Senate of those committees. Now, so they have the same documents. The problem is this, and this is how bad it has become. You have inside the Senate, people think, I'm going to vote for Congressperson X, and Congressperson X is going to go to Washington, they're going to represent my interests, they're going to thoughtfully look at legislation and issues and do their best to serve the public interest. The reality is really quite different. You have most of these Congress people are spending 20 to 30 hours a week dialing for dollars. What are they not doing if they're dialing for dollars? They're not really doing their job as political representatives. Who's doing that work? It's their staff. Who controls the staffs in Congress, in the Senate, in the House? These are loyalists with the parties. So if you're a Republican and you go as a congressperson, you go to Washington, the core of your staff is handed to you by the party. So who's actually running the government? Not the elected representatives. The only ones that actually have that role are the ones who represent the core of the party. People like Lindsey Graham is a good example. He's an insider in the Republican Party. He makes a lot of decisions as a senior party person in regard to what does and doesn't happen inside of Congress, because he directs a lot of money. He also oversees the appointments of the staff members to various representatives. The new ones coming in, like Senator McSally down there in Arizona, she's an idiot. She actually put out to her constituents that Well, she doesn't look like she's doing a lot because she was told to keep her head down for the first couple of years. I'm going, what the hell are you talking about, dear? You need to get the hell out of Congress.
Well, you went to Congresswoman Barbara Lee about this corruption,
yes.
And what happened?
Oh, yeah.
What happened with your visit to Barbara Lee?
It was my first clue. It was the first time I really was told what was going on inside of Congress, that it's the staff that basically they act as gatekeepers for what the congressperson does and doesn't hear, does and doesn't know. Uh-huh. So when this stuff was coming into the office there, some of the staff members started telling Barbara Lee about it. Of course, she's an insider in the Democratic Party. I don't know what her real intentions were, but it was clear from what I was being told that as soon as the widespread problem inside of the DOL in San Francisco became visible to them in their office, they were getting lots of complaints. They were immediately put under surveillance. It's like, whoa, this is like the Gestapo. We're not in San Francisco anymore. And so, the senior, and I've got her name somewhere here, she told me that almost immediately they were put under surveillance. The stuff was being misdirected. And in fact, they were trying to insulate Barbara Lee, with or without her knowledge, from actually having the information about this widespread problem in the Department of Labor. That may have been convenient for her, because then she doesn't have to, she can say, oh, I just didn't know, it's deniability. But it tells you that the staff members, there's a lot of corruption, serious corruption in the staffing system in Congress. We've seen that because you have Henry Kerner, right, and Tristan Levin. Both of them, Tristan came in as deputy special counsel and principal deputy special counsel, and Henry Kerner came in as special counsel. Guess where they came from? And they were both thoroughly corrupt. They came from the staff. They were both staff members with Charles Grassley and that committee. The ultimate whistleblower guy in Congress, right out of his staff. And what did they immediately do? They adapted to attacking whistleblowers. What does that tell you?
Well, I think that the further evidence of systemic corruption and both parties being responsible for the continuation of this corruption. So I think this Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General who's exposed, who's gone to Congress and says that this whistleblowing is important, the other whistleblowing of many, federal employees about systemic corruption and cover-up, and private workers who complain about corruption needs to be investigated as well. And hopefully this will be taken up as you and your fellow colleagues work together to take this up. So thanks for joining us on KPFA WorkWeek Radio. We've been talking with Darrell Whitman, who is a former federal OSHA Whistleblower Protection Program lawyer and investigator, and talking to WorkWeek about the Michael Horowitz action in Congress and the whole non-controversy about whistleblowers and illegal activity.